Chapter 3. Castle Highcliffe was appropriately named, Gillen thought. He checked Blaze's easy canter and slumped in the saddle, studying the castle. There was nothing remarkable about the building itself. It was a solid granite structure with the usual four corner towers, joined by crenellated walls. A single taller tower stood in the centre of the enclosed space. That would be the keep, he thought, where the castle's eating, sleeping, and administration quarters were located. But it was the site on which the castle had been built that gave it its name. The coastline in this part of Araluen was formed by high rocky cliffs of white chalk. The castle had been built on a high outcrop, a peninsula joined to the coast by a narrow, winding neck of land barely 20 metres wide. On either side of this path, steep cliffs dropped away to where the sea crashed constantly against the rocks, sending tall columns of spray skywards and creating a rhythmic, booming sound. Tumbled piles of chalky rock at the base of the cliffs showed where the path was being constantly undermined and eaten away by the waves' incessant attack. In time, he thought, the path would disappear completely, leaving Highcliffe to stand on an island. As he watched, he saw men patrolling the castle walls. In one of the towers on the landward side, he could make out a tiny figure leaning his elbows on the parapet. Another figure joined the first, arm outstretched, pointing towards the spot where Gillen and Blaze stood motionless. The first guard straightened up from his relaxed position and turned away, doubtless calling an alert to someone below. "They've seen us," Gillen told Blaze. "We are a little obvious, silhouetted against the skyline like this." "I wasn't trying to creep up unobserved," Gillen said, and Blaze sniffed disdainfully. She had a habit of doing that, Gillen thought. Knowing he would never manage to have the last word with his horse, he urged her forward, and she picked her way carefully down the rocky path to the beginning of the isthmus leading to the castle. There was a sentry point there, manned by two bored-looking soldiers. Gillen identified himself, although the ranger cloak and massive longbow left little doubt as to who or what he was, and the senior man present nodded to him. "Just wait a moment, please, Ranger," he said. His voice was respectful, even wary. The Ranger Corps' reputation was the reason for the twofold reaction. The soldier nudged his companion with an elbow. "Run up the yellow flag, Nobby," he said. Without a word, the second man stepped to a mast nearby, where Gillen could see there were two flags attached to halyards, ready to be run up. One was yellow, the other red. Nobby selected the yellow and hoisted the square of coloured cloth to the top of the mast. The flag vibrated in the stiff ocean breeze, standing out from the flagpole. After a few seconds, an answering flag appeared at the castle gate. Presumably, thought Gillen, had he been identified as an enemy, the soldiers would have signalled with the red flag. Had he been an enemy, of course, he might not have given them the chance, although he supposed no signal would be taken to mean the same as a red flag. It was probably better for the sentries' morale to believe that they had a chance of signalling if an enemy were to arrive at the guard post. "Go on across, Ranger," said the soldier. Gillen waved a hand in acknowledgement and started Blaze forward. He let the reins go slack, allowing the horse to pick her own way. The isthmus wasn't particularly narrow for a single rider, but he was conscious of the steep drop-off on either side to the sea below. As he approached the castle gate and portcullis, the track narrowed considerably, so that there would have been room for no more than 4 men abreast to approach the castle entrance. He touched the reins lightly as they reached the portcullis, and Blaze came to a halt as a sergeant stepped forward. The man's keen gaze took in the cloak and the longbow Gillen carried across his saddlebow. He also noticed the long sword hanging at the ranger's left side and frowned. Swords were not normally part of a ranger's weaponry. Gillen nodded approvingly. The two outer guards hadn't noticed the weapon, or if they had attached no significance to it. He produced the silver oak leaf that hung on a chain round his neck and leaned forward so that the sergeant could see it clearly. Ranger Gillen, temporarily detached on special duties, he said. The sergeant studied the amulet, glanced once more at the sword, then came to a decision. He signalled for the single pole barrier across the gateway to be raised, then stepped to one side. "Pass through, Ranger Gillen," he said. "The seneschal's office is straight ahead, on the ground floor of the keep." Gillen nodded and urged Blaze forward through the shadows of the massive gateway. Her hooves rang loudly as they passed onto the flagstones of the castle courtyard. As Gillen dismounted, a stable hand materialized beside him. "Can I look after your horse, Ranger?" he asked. Gillen considered for a second or two. It was his normal practice to tend to Blaze himself. "That would be kind of you," he said. "We've come a long way, so please give her a good rub-down and a measure of grain." The stable hand nodded and reached for Blaze's bridle. As Gillen handed it over, he said to the bay, "Go along, Blaze." Thus instructed, his horse turned and clip-clopped after the stable hand towards the wooden building by the north wall that housed the stables. Gillen smiled quietly to himself. Had he not said those 3 simple words, she would have been as immovable as the north wall itself. He entered the keep. The ground floor was largely open space. In the centre was a large wooden staircase leading to the next level. In the event of an attack, the stairs could be burnt or smashed down once the inhabitants had escaped to the higher floor, leaving attackers with no way to access them. From there, access to higher floors would be by the same right-hand spiralling staircases he had remarked on at Araluen. On the left-hand side, a large area was closed off by a timber wall. He guessed it was the guard room, where sentries could relax or sleep while not on duty. On the right-hand side, another wall separated a slightly smaller area. This would be the seneschal's or castle manager's office. As a ranger, Gillen could simply head for the higher levels, where he would find the baron's quarters. But it was good etiquette to approach the seneschal first, and he saw no reason to ruffle any feathers just to prove his own importance. A slightly overweight man sat at a table outside the large, brass-bound door to the office. The sleeves of his jerkin were clad in black cloth to protect them from ink stains, and he was copying a list of figures from a parchment sheet into a large journal. He looked up at the sound of Gillen's boots on the flagstones. "Can I help you?" he said politely. Gillen tossed his cloak back over his shoulders and proffered the silver oak leaf once more. "My name is Gillen. I'm a King's Ranger," he said. "I'd like to see the seneschal, please." "Of course. Please, wait a moment." The clerk set his quill pen down and rose, hurrying to the door that led to the inner office. He disappeared inside for less than a minute, then emerged once more, beckoning to Gillen. "Please, come in. Seneschal Philip is at your service. Can I get you some refreshments?" Gillen hesitated. It had been a long ride, and the sea breeze over the last 10 kilometres had been chilly. "Coffee, if you have it." The clerk bowed and gestured him through the doorway. "I'll bring it right away," he said, as Gillen entered the office. The seneschal was an elderly man. His long hair was completely grey and his face was lined. Although, thought Gillen, that might be the result of the rigours of his office rather than age. He was rising from behind his desk as the ranger entered, his hand outstretched in greeting. "Welcome to Highcliffe, Ranger Gillen," he said. "It's an honour to have such a distinguished guest." The words could have been obsequious, but Philip seemed genuine enough. Yet there was something about him that bothered Gillen. He seemed ill at ease in Gillen's presence. He ushered Gillen to a chair in front of his large desk. "Please, sit down, Ranger. I'm sorry to say you've caught us unprepared. Baron Douglas is out hunting. He won't be back for several hours. But if I can help you in any way—" Gillen waved the apology aside. "I'm in no rush," he told the man. "I'm happy to wait for the Baron's return. In the meantime, you might be able to provide me with some information." As he said the words, Gillen was sure he saw the beginnings of a guilty start, hastily covered. His eyes narrowed slightly. Philip was definitely nervous about something. And Gillen already had suspicions that there was an informant in the castle, someone placed high enough to have known about the recent pay convoy and its route. "Information?" Philip said. By now, he had his reactions under more control, and his voice was steady and his manner non-committal. "What would that be about?" There was a tap at the door, and the clerk entered, bearing a tray with a cup of coffee. Gillen decided not to answer immediately. He wanted to give the other man time to wonder what information he might be looking for. He accepted the cup, added sugar, and took a deep, appreciative sip. He nodded his thanks to the clerk, who withdrew from the room. As the door closed behind him, Gillen turned back to Philip. "I'm trying to track down a man called Foldar," Gillen said. "You may have heard of him." Now, Philip's face darkened, anger replacing the former nervousness. "Foldar?" he said. "I've never known a man so evil. In my opinion, he was worse than Morgorath himself." Gillen looked up quickly. "You knew him?" Philip nodded several times before answering. When he did speak again, his mind was obviously far away. "Oh, yes, I knew him," he said. "Knew both of them, as a matter of fact. Evil they were. I suppose that's what attracted Foldar to Morgorath. As they say, like clings to like." "How did you come to meet them?" Gillen asked, fascinated. He hadn't met many people who had actually known Morgorath, even though the former Baron's shadow had loomed over Araluen for so many years. Philip's eyes rose to meet his. "At Castle Gorlan," he said. "I began my training in service there as a junior steward. Of course, I wouldn't actually say that I knew him, not in the sense of sharing time with them or meeting them, but I saw plenty of them around the castle, and that was enough for me. I couldn't wait to leave the place." "When was that?" Gillen asked. He was feigning only polite interest, but his senses were tingling. In spite of Philip's claim that he couldn't abide Morgorath's former lieutenant, he had admitted that he knew Foldar in the past. Perhaps that had been enough to secure Philip's current services for the outlaw. "Must have been 3 or 4 years before Morgorath's revolt," Philip told him. "I could see something bad was coming, and I wanted no part in it. So I got out. Cost me a year's seniority and 3 months' pay, but I figure I got the best deal in the long run." Interesting, Gillen thought. The man would have little reason to be loyal to Morgorath or Foldar, but then again, he might have been a carefully placed agent, with his departure from Gorlan Fife a cunningly planned ruse. Morgorath had been a man more than capable of such devious planning and advance plotting. "What makes you think Foldar is anywhere in this region?" Philip asked, interrupting his thoughts. There was a report of an attack on a pay convoy. Men killed in cold blood, gold stolen. It had all the hallmarks of the sort of thing Foldar would get up to. Philip nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I remember that," he said. "I was the one who sent in the report. At the time, I never associated it with Foldar. Although, come to think of it, one of the survivors did say that the leader of the bandits wore a black cloak. Still, it seems a pretty thin connection to Foldar. Are you sure it was him?" "No, not at all. I'm chasing down leads all over the kingdom. This seemed one of the most likely. I'll stay a few days, nose around the area, ask people if they've seen any suspicious gatherings of men, do a bit of scouting through the forest. If there's a robber band anywhere in the district, that's where they'll most likely be. I'll see what I come up with." It all sounded vague and indefinite, he thought. He didn't mention that he was hatching a plan to entrap the bandits. He wasn't sure yet where Philip's loyalties might lie. The seneschal shrugged. "I suppose that's all you can do," he agreed. "Who knows? Something might turn up." "My thoughts exactly," Gillen replied. He set his cup down and rose from his chair. "Now, if you have someone show me to my quarters, I'll let you get back to your work." Philip rose also, accompanying him to the door. "My clerk will show you to your rooms," he said. As he opened the door, the clerk looked up. "Take Ranger Gillen to the guest apartment on the 4th floor," Philip told him. Then, turning to Gillen again, he said, "I'll send word when the Baron returns from hunting. I'm sure he'll want to see you immediately." The guest accommodation was a comfortable suite of 3 rooms, overlooking the ocean. In a building like this, Gillen thought, sited as it was, most rooms would overlook the ocean. A clean salt breeze swept in through the open windows, sending the heavy curtains billowing. There were shutters, but Gillen chose to leave them open. He liked fresh air, and the cold that accompanied it didn't bother him. After he'd settled in, he went to the stables to check on Blaze. There was another bay, a gelding, in one of the stalls near the entrance. For a few seconds in the dim interior, he mistook it for Blaze. Then he heard her familiar nicker and realized she was stabled 4 stalls away. The stable hand had done a good job, and Blaze was comfortable in a dry stall, with plenty of fresh straw and a bin half full of grain. The water in the bucket hanging from a hook was fresh and clean. Nodding approval, he patted her muzzle and then turned away, just as a castle servant entered looking for him. "The seneschal said to tell you Baron Douglas has returned. He'll see you now." Douglas had his office and sleeping quarters on the 3rd floor. Gillen frowned slightly at that. A careful commander would cite his command position higher in the tower, not in the more easily accessible lower levels. Douglas had possibly grown lazy, he thought, and maybe had an aversion to climbing too many stairs. His first sight of the Baron of Highcliffe confirmed the guess. Baron Douglas was seriously overweight. Gillen knew that other barons, like Arald of Redmont, struggled to maintain their waistlines, but Douglas seemed to have no such inhibitions. He was tall, about the same height as Gillen, and his hair was thinning on top. As if to compensate for that fact, he kept it long on the sides. Gillen guessed that on formal occasions he might well comb it over the top to disguise the pink scalp showing through. He was clean-shaven, fleshy in the jowls, and his blue eyes were set close together. That gave him a slightly shifty look, Gillen thought. Then he discounted the idea. Douglas couldn't be blamed for the positioning of his eyes, any more than he could be blamed for his tendency to baldness. The Baron spoke a little too loudly, as if he were conscious of his own importance and constantly trying to assert it. His manner was abrupt, although he stopped short of actual rudeness. No wise man was ever rude to a ranger.
"Philip tells me you think that Devil Foldar is somewhere in Highcliffe,"
he said, after they had gone through the formalities of introduction. Gillen shrugged. "I'm following leads," he said. "There's a chance that he could be here. I'm sure Philip mentioned the raid on the pay convoy some weeks back."
That? Shouldn't think that was Foldar. Just bandits, if you ask me."
"You're probably right, although your seneschal did agree that the attack was the sort of thing Foldar would organize. Apparently he knew him some years back. How about you? Did you ever meet him?" Douglas sat upright.
"Me? No, never laid eyes on him. I never want to either. Why do you ask?"
he added, leaning forward suspiciously. Gillen waved a hand casually. "I'd be interested in getting a more complete picture of the man. The more I know about him, the easier it might be to predict his moves."
"Well, I can't help you there,"
Douglas said, his tone indicating that he felt this interview had gone on long enough.
"Anything else I can do for you, just ask. Better still, ask Philip. He's the man to get things done."
"I'll try not to be too much of a bother," Gillen said, smiling. Douglas shook his head emphatically. He did most things emphatically, Gillen thought.
No bother at all."
Already he had dismissed Gillen as a concern.